Please join me in prayer. Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I'll admit that it's kind of hard for me to see Elijah as a sympathetic figure. Yes, he's a prophet of God, and his zeal for God in a time when it is profoundly hard, deeply dangerous to have zeal for God is without question. But Elijah, if we're being perfectly honest, is also a man of violence. Or at least he is a man who is adapted to a violent time. Elijah had just orchestrated the deaths of hundreds of prophets of Baal. Baal was an important Canaanite deity, and Jezebel, the queen of Israel, was a devout worshiper. In fact, Elijah's violence was an echo of her violence in killing the prophets of the Lord. So, in a world that was defined by this reciprocal violence, in a world where people find themselves trapped in that destructive cycle, Jezebel's oath to kill Elijah more than makes sense. It's essentially the only thing that could happen. You know, Elijah, who up to that point had been bold to the point of lunacy, the way prophets tend to be bold to the point of lunacy, had had enough. He cuts and runs. Maybe it's the fact that he and Jezebel are a lot alike when you get right down to it. With everybody else, including her husband, King Ahab, trying to find a balance between Yahweh and Baal, she's really the only one with a zeal for her God that matches Elijah's zeal for God. It might have made her threat seem more personal. I mean, she sent him a personal message rather than an assassin. I don't quite know what that says, but it sure did scare Elijah half to death. No matter why, something seemed to break in Elijah. I mean, he's overwhelmed. He's afraid. He seems traumatized, perhaps both by what he's witnessed and by what he's done. His heart and mind, they're chaotic, and he's even found a way to catastrophize in a catastrophic situation. And I think many of us have been there. We've known what it's like when the stress of our lives, the stress we've been ignoring, finally catches up to us and we just hit a wall. It's in this state that Elijah cries out to God, and God feeds him. God leads him to Mount Horeb, a mountain associated with Moses receiving the Ten Commandments. God, you see, is about to pass by. Then comes this cacophony of nature's power that we can only describe as biblical in scope. Wind, shaking earth, and fire are enough to overwhelm the senses. But God was not in the wind. God was not in the earthquake. God was not in the fire. But you see, I think Elijah's heart was. I think this was kind of a representation of what drove him into his wall, into his state of burnout, both his inner life and the violent political world that he moved in. But then, after this cacophony of nature, came silence. And Elijah seemed to know intuitively that within this silence, a sheer silence, a fine silence in some translations, within this silence, the presence of God was. It was a silence so unlike the silence that answered Baal's prophets in the previous chapter when they tried to call fire down onto their altar. It was in this silence, the silence Elijah could finally be present in, that God spoke to him and God sent him on his way, changed, rejuvenated, somehow continuing in his work. I think it's a comfort to know that underneath the clatter and the cacophony of our lives, the silence of God, the silence too deep for noise, waits. But doesn't it seem hard at times to listen to the silence of God? The world around us, the rhythms of our lives are noisy, they're distracting. And maybe that's by design. I was a nervous kid. I was a really anxious kid. And I remember when I prayed, my prayers had this frantic quality to them. I'd essentially never stop talking. I never stopped my constant litany of things I wanted or things that I didn't want to happen, and I never took a pause. Because you see, I read enough of the Bible to know that in that pause, in that silence, God might speak to my heart. And God seemed like the kind of God who just might call you out of your comfort zone, just might rearrange your perspective, just might change who you are in your hearts in some significant way. And I was afraid of that. The Gerasenes were afraid too. They also encountered a quiet that showed the presence of God. This was the quiet of their demoniac, now clothed and in his right mind, now indistinguishable from them. And really, at first glance, the reaction seems to be counterintuitive. Wouldn't it be cause for joy that someone they knew, someone they had essentially been managing as long as anybody can remember, was now just like them? But you see, I think that was the problem. Because he was their demoniac. He was their outsider. The anthropologist René Girard would call him their scapegoat. And now that he was just like them in the silence that followed his healing, this would be what Girard would call a mimetic crisis. Too many people trying to be like each other, now without a person to dump all their anxiety onto, their hostility, their fears of inadequacy. You see, as long as the demoniac was the demoniac, as long as he was the outcast howling among the tombs, all the other townsfolk could be secure in their knowledge that they were not that their friends and their neighbors were not that. Think of it this way. Every job I've ever worked at has the designated incompetent employee. Has anybody watched the sitcom Parks and Recreation? Show of hands. That's Jerry in Parks and Recreation. It's Jerry. You know the one everybody has stories about? The ways you take time to laugh at their failures. And that person, see, the dirty little secret is that incompetent person is the most important employee on the job. How else are the other employees supposed to be confident in their roles as the good ones? How are they supposed to keep from tearing each other apart in competition to be the good one? In that same way, the demoniac, as a demoniac, was the most important part of his community. The silence of his healing, of being clothed and in his right mind, called his community to change, to renewal. Just as the silence Elijah encountered, it called him to renewal. In this case, the challenge within that silence was to be a community not dependent on outcasts for their stability. Jesus' healing pointed to another way, because in the silence of the demoniac's healing was the abundant love of God, the abundant care of God. A community that needs a scapegoat or an outcast is implicitly operating on a logic of scarcity. There's not enough love, esteem, validation, or whatever to go around, and someone needs to be on the outs. Jesus came with a logic of abundance, a logic that says there is no longer slave nor free. There is no longer Jew nor Greek. All the categories of inclusion and exclusion are now moot in the light of God's love. And you see in the sheer silence of the demoniac, it called the townsfolk to reevaluate how their society works. And they were afraid. And really, honestly, I would be. Wouldn't you be? A complete overhaul of the status quo. The presence of God is often in silence. It's in the calm after the storm. It's in the peace after a healing. And it can be frightening to be calm, to be present and listen to those times, because who knows what the Lord could say to you? Who knows what newness the Lord could call you to participate in? But in that silence, in all times, the Lord loves you and calls you to be renewed, healed, and changed. Thank you.